in this week's program, we've been looking at, among other things, how the left will respond to and should respond to the suspension of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign and the challenge going forward of organizing, not just for elections, but for the creation and expansion of a sustainable left movement in this country. My next guest is the co-author of a new and extremely timely book on this subject, just released by Verso Press. The book is called Bigger Than Bernie: How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. The book is by Megan Day and Micah Uetricht, and Micah Uetricht joins us now. So first of all, Micah, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, definitely. It's a pleasure. And obviously, you and Megan have been thinking about this for a while. You wrote this book. I know that at the time you wrote it, there were three possibilities, right? Bernie wins, another Democrat wins and becomes president, or Trump gets reelected. And as I've said, like ceaselessly, the response of the left in each case would have to be organize, right? Build and organize. But, you know, one of the questions that I think is open for the left is Bernie has been, beyond a doubt, I think, the most successful self-described democratic socialist president in U.S. history. What does that mean now that he's not apparently going to be the candidate, in your view?
Means a couple things. One is that he has, I think, through both of his campaigns, the first one in 2016 and one today, has really unleashed all kinds of new movements or led to the rebirth of certain movements, like the American Socialist Movement, for example, which after his first campaign exploded through the Democratic Socialists of America, which are now a major political force in American life. Certainly not in power or anything like that, but before his first campaign, socialism was a dirty word in American politics. And now maybe it's still a dirty word, but at least, you know, mainstream media and mainstream politicians feel the need to say why socialists are wrong rather than just pretend that we don't exist at all. So there's been major growth of the socialist movement through his campaign. There's been growth through, electorally through candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar in the House, but also, as we talk about in the book, democratic socialists and other kinds of left progressive elected officials who have been elected up and down the ticket from the local level, the state level to the House. And they're going to be the electoral standard bearers of this new left movement going forward. And we've got things on the table that were not on the table before, where, we have solid majorities of Americans in many polls who say that they believe we should have a Medicare for all system. Certainly under the coronavirus pandemic, that need has become clearer than ever. We have the Green New Deal on the table. We weren't even talking about a Green New Deal even 3 years ago. Even Bernie's first campaign, we weren't talking about the Green New Deal. Now, that is the central demand of the environmental movement to stop climate change. So we're operating in a totally reshaped political climate in the United States. And I think we have, there were objective conditions in American society and our economy and all the rest of it to help lead to this moment. But Bernie helped cohere these many movements that have come out of his campaign. And I think that in the years and decades to come, we will view his two campaigns as a real turning point in the long history of American politics.
So I just want to say a quick story, Michael, which is, I worked on Bernie's first campaign. I think I was employee number 5 or something.
Ground floor.
What?
You were in on the ground floor.
Yeah, no, and I just felt there was like maybe something there. And I went on a vacation trip to the Adirondacks very early. And there was a big sign somebody put up, right-wing country, sort of not far from where I grew up. And it said, Trump for the White House, Hillary for the jailhouse, Bernie for the nut house. And I just thought, we're getting there. We're getting the name recognition. But, to me, there were, I think, I think what Bernie did was extraordinary. And I think there were 3 strands to it. And certainly implicit in your book and discussed. one was the policies, of course, right? I mean, that Bernie identified policies for which there's an enormous groundswell, and not just among the young, and I'm not being dismissive of the young, but among, for example, if you've seen the polling, swing Obama to Trump voters, very surprisingly receptive to Medicare for all, Green New Deal, may not know all the details, but they want these big ideas, right? And then the third is, especially among younger voters, which I find a hopeful trend, turning away from capitalism as an ideology and a gravitation towards socialism. So you have these kind of, to me, these three strands woven together, kind of, and obviously there were predecessor movements to Bernie's in Occupy and so on, but you have these three strands now emerging in American politics. And there's those who say, well, if you don't call it democratic socialism or socialism, it'll do better. There are other, you're imposing barriers. There are others who say, no, the critique of capitalism is actually what will give it its long-term force. I think you and Megan, and I think even, and this is among people who agree on the policy strand. So I guess implicitly, I mean, or explicitly, you and Megan seem to be clear that the label itself matters in the building of a movement and perhaps down the road a party. But am I reading you correctly?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the common sense of American politics, basically up until the Bernie campaign, going from what Joseph McCarthy to the Bernie campaign, it was that Americans just won't go for this socialism stuff. They're scared of it. They're kind of fundamentally opposed to it. Deep down in their bones, there's something unique about America that makes Americans really suspicious of that stuff. And so if you were going to be a socialist, you had to be very private about it. You couldn't proclaim from the mountaintops that this is what you believed in. You couldn't say that you want a very different looking society, one in which everybody is treated with dignity. You had to kind of smuggle it in through the back door. And we learned from Bernie's campaign that actually the argument, the campaigning on the slogan, under the banner of democratic socialism, was actually very beneficial to Bernie, because there are many people around this country who, they're not, Marxists, but they recognize there's something that is deeply wrong in America today that is leading to massive inequality, that is making it so that 500,000 people every year are declaring bankruptcy over medical bills in the richest country in the world. All of this, the miseries of American life that we know are out there. They see those realities and they think something really radically different needs to take shape in this society. And so when Bernie is unafraid to call himself a democratic socialist, they realize that he is proposing, big stuff. He's making big proposals to change our society, and they think that maybe that is what is needed at a moment when the status quo has failed so many people.
So again, and excuse me for my audience, a little bit of health, so I may, a little bit of health challenge, so I may take a pause for breath here or there. But so, and again, we're talking with Micah Uetricht, who is the co-author of the new book, Bigger Than Bernie. And I think that's, by the way, I think that's exactly right. And, I always focus on, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Micah. I always focus on, we have a Democratic Party. A lot of people in and close to the leadership of that party are constantly haranguing, in my view, the left over, the 1.2% who voted for Jill Stein. If you hadn't done whatever, right. Ralph Nader, if you hadn't done blah, this or that. But they don't focus on the 48 or 46 percent of the electorate that doesn't vote at all, the kind of dark matter of the political universe right there. And so and that to me, in some cases, may be tactical and deliberate. In other cases, I think it's just like, not thinking very deeply about what's going on. But, that 46%, they face structural racism, structural poverty, deliberate efforts to make it impossible for them to vote, which I think will be quadrupled this year. And but in addition to that, I just always think of the single mother who's working 2 shifts at a fast food restaurant, doesn't know what hours she's going to be working every day. You're going to make her take 6 hours, like get her mom or somebody to watch the kids while she takes a crosstown bus, waits online to vote. If it's not something, if it's more of the same she's been experiencing, ever since she opened her eyes, I just figured she's not going to show up. And why, and there's this sort of scolding attitude among some Democratic elites. But my attitude is, have you given her a reason? And where does democratic socialism fit in that, in your view?
Well, yeah, I think that what you're saying is exactly true. I had this experience when I was in Iowa knocking on doors. I went to Iowa for 3 weekends knocking on doors for Bernie. And I was in mostly working class neighborhoods, and I was knocking on doors of people who were not particularly, they probably don't listen to your podcast or read my magazine. They're not, the high volume of political consumers. And I would talk to them about Bernie Sanders. They didn't know much about him. And their reaction was not that they disagreed with what I was saying Bernie was fighting for. It was almost like they didn't believe that the things that I was saying he wanted were possible in American politics.
Uh-huh.
They didn't believe that we actually could take on the pharmaceutical companies and the health insurance companies and win Medicare for all. They didn't think that we could pry some of the wealth out of the hands of billionaires in this country and redistribute it to people. I mean, I think to some of them, I had to wonder. I mean, I was in Iowa, which went for Barack Obama in 2008, and some people said to me, that they thought that Obama was going to deliver health care, and he didn't. I mean, obviously the story is more complicated, but that was how they told it. Thought Obama was going to give us, health care, and then he didn't. And so people have had their expectations in the past raised high, and then it didn't come to much. And so part of what was so difficult for Bernie was not just that he had to take on all of these corporate interests. He had to rebuild in people's minds the very possibility that you could use the political system to make people's lives better. That's an incredibly tall order, and that's obviously one that we're still stuck with after the Bernie campaign is over. I think it's going to fall to Democratic Socialists, not just at the ballot box, not just elected officials, but also in grassroots movements, in the labor movement, in the environmental movement, and the movements for affordable housing, and all the other movements that we write about in the book. It's going to fall on that movement to help rebuild that sense of possibility that we can actually change the miseries of our world. And it's a tall order, but it's absolutely crucial to accomplish if we're going to be able to see any kind of change in this country and use the democratic process to get people excited about candidates like Bernie.
Whenever I agree with that, whenever I think about that, I think about it in a very different context. The left-wing educator Paulo Freire in Brazil used the phrase in the 60s, internalizing the oppressor consciousness. The idea that somehow so many people have just thought, this is the way it is. This is the natural design of the world. It can't be changed. And really, Elon Musk or whomever, Jeff Bezos, is in some way a superior human being. And if somebody comes along, and this is so deeply embedded, not just in some working people, but even in the professional class that's the backbone of the Democratic Party, is like Hillary says, oh, the pony. I think you guys, maybe you quote her, I don't know, but Bernie thinks there's ponies for everybody. As opposed to, well, if everybody wants a pony, by the way, we can breed ponies. We have that talent.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's such a stupid thing to say, but it's also a kind of beating down of the public's sense of empowerment. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but it just came to mind. So
no, it's true. And that is one of the worst sins of the Democratic Party over the last several decades. I mean, we know what the Republican Party is about, right? We know that the Republicans are devoted to, taking from the poor and giving to the rich, maintaining hierarchies of, racial and gender and sexual orientation, and all of those things. We know what they're about. They're sort of cravenly reactionary, and the Democratic Party is supposed to be, supposedly the party of the people, and yet we have a Democratic Party that has refused to fight for any of the most basic things that people need in society. And then we have major figureheads like Hillary Clinton, deriding the desire for that kind of change as people wanting ponies. And so it's led to average people just thinking, what's the point? Why should I put my faith or hope, or why should I even get out to the ballot box, much less get involved in the political process in a more substantive way, volunteer for a candidate or join a grassroots campaign for affordable housing or anything else? And Bernie's whole argument about how he was going to win, his path to victory, was that he was going to inspire huge numbers of new voters among those who don't normally vote. And that is a very admirable thing to aim for. But of course, he didn't, as he himself admits, he didn't accomplish that through this campaign. And so, again, that is going to be a central task going forward for anybody who wants to continue to, hold up the banner of left-wing politics, is convincing people that, yes, we actually can change the world. We are not doomed to a world of massive inequality and one where we can't access healthcare for free and we can't afford our rent and all the rest of it. And there's not a lot of easy answers on how to do that, but we do profile in the book some of the recent campaigns in places like Chicago, where I live, where we have half a dozen members of the city council who are members of the Democratic Socialists of America, where we've had several successful teacher strikes that have totally reshaped politics in the city, or New York, where with the election of AOC and State Senator Julia Salazar, who's also a socialist, they played key roles in these fights against Amazon when they were trying to move into Queens. I mean, there are real numbers on the board that we can point to and say, look, when we do organize and we fight, we can win. And we have to do more of that if we're going to ever make these kind of massive changes in society and actually win the confidence of average working class people that they're not doomed to a life of misery.
And again, we're talking with Micah Uetricht, who's the co-author of the new book, Bigger Than Bernie. And Micah, I want to talk about a couple of things with you. I want to talk about the role of the Democratic Party in this process. But first, I want to quote, if I can find it, you guys talk about Eugene V. Debs, who I know was a hero of Bernie's. And Debs, by any horse race standard of American politics, and trust me, Bernie despises the horse race reporting just as much as everybody thinks he does. So he ran for president, as you say, on the Socialist Party ticket 5 times, most successful in 1912, 6% of the vote, which by the horse race standards, that's not very much. That's like John Anderson in 1976 or something. But when the crisis hit of the Great Depression, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president in 1932, so many of the things that Debs proposed that were considered loony left, socialist, all became U.S. policy, government policy. So, I mean, Chris Cillizza or whoever, some commentator would say, that guy, fringe. But everything that he proposed within not everything, a number of the things he proposed that were considered impossible became law 20, 25 years later. So I'm not exactly sure why I brought that up, to be honest, but perhaps to pivot to one, I think we don't measure the right things sometimes about what constitutes the road to political success, if you know what I mean. I've read, because I track all this stuff, countless articles about, the left was supposed to do so well in 2018, but, so-and-so in Nebraska didn't make it. Well, you guys are like, those people who do that writing, I feel like they're watching the wrong clock, if you know what I mean, but I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, those people, it feels like they have those articles pre-written for as soon as some left-wing candidate somewhere loses. They're just like, chomping at the bit to be able to publish their trashing of a left-wing politician. But no, your point about the New Deal and FDR is true. I mean, there's both the fact that the Socialist Party and the Communist Party were putting forward the kind of proposal that ended up making it in the New Deal. So the actual stuff that these radicals were proposing made it into the New Deal, but also that the radicals were not just making policy proposals; they were also intimately involved in labor organizing or unemployed worker organizing, fighting evictions, all the stuff that socialists and communists and radicals did in the 30s, especially, and that kind of pressure at the grassroots level is also what led to people who are elected officials and bureaucrats in the U.S. government deciding, we better pass a new deal that will actually we got to throw these people some bones because they're literally rioting in the streets. And we're not anywhere near that level of upsurge right now, but we are certainly seeing, I mean, before this pandemic hit, we were seeing an expansion of the teacher strike wave
Right.
Many of its participants were inspired by the Bernie Sanders campaign and participated in it, and then went and helped organize their coworkers to, even in red states, to go on these massive strikes. And then once the coronavirus has hit, we have seen all kinds of organizing, Whole Foods, Instacart. I mean, there's a huge list of these companies where workers, Amazon, who are going on strike because they are dealing with extremely unsafe working conditions. And it's that kind of militancy on the job and in the streets that is what led to the New Deal, making for a much better standard of living for average working class people in this country. And in the 21st century, it's what we're going to need to, in the immediate term, stop the worst of the kind of austerity and giveaways to corporations, and to actually win a response to the coronavirus that can meet average people's needs. And so that combination of winning the policy level fight, the argument about whether we need something like Medicare for all and convincing people of that, but then also going on strike or, engaging in rent strikes, refusing to pay rent when you don't have the money, or that kind of protest and disruptive action on the job, that's what led to the New Deal. And that's what's going to save us in the midst of the coronavirus and once the coronavirus is gone.
So Micah Uetricht, co-author of the book Bigger Than Bernie. I was going to ask you about the Democratic Party, but you brought up something I'm more excited about at this particular instant, which is not that I'm, obviously that's an important conversation too about electoral politics, but I've always said, elections are like Christmas tree lights. It's the current that goes between them that's the illumination, right? And that's organizing, that's human power. And one of the great opportunities that I hope we don't miss in this current moment is exactly what you're talking about. It was building with the teachers' strikes, the teachers' revolts, which, by the way, were a red state, right? They were West Virginia, they were Oklahoma, they were Arizona. Now we've got real worker action outside the, institutional structures as they currently exist primarily. And we've got a moment in history, unexpectedly, and in certain cases tragically, certainly with the death toll, but we've got a moment in history where it turns out that all the power of the corporate class, the capitalist class, of the investor class, for all the massive resources that are being deployed to save them. Now, we're broadcast on cable TV and syndicated on a radio, so I can't use the language I might use, but they are scared significantly by the prospect, first of all, by the sudden absence of a workforce. It's like, who knew? Bosses still need workers, right? It's not all digital and investment. So it's caused utter terror, panic, danger to the economy. Some workers are beginning, like the ones you mentioned, to recognize that translates to worker power. But I feel that we've just had a flash of illumination that, you know what? They can't do without us. What do we do with that understanding and that power? And I'd love your thoughts on that.
Right. There's the famous line in the old Union song, Solidarity Forever, when it says, without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. And
right.
When your Instacart worker goes on strike and your Instacart delivery doesn't show up, you are immediately confronted with that fact. Or your Amazon package handler goes on strike and all of a sudden the Amazon packages stop flowing. That is the power that we have in society, that average working people have. We are the reason that the system functions at all. And so that is where our power lies. I mean, that's the old socialist argument, right? And it sounds kind of basic, but especially in the middle of a pandemic, you realize that workers have real power. We have our hands on the levers of society that make it all grind to a halt and make the people who are, the Jeff Bezoses the world and the CEOs sit up and pay attention when you engage in that kind of action. So, it's happening. It's sort of popping off everywhere right now. People are going on strike, usually without a union at this point. People are just terrified to go into work and understand that they and their coworkers are at risk. And so they're organizing in this kind of ad hoc way to take this militant action of going on strike. And I think that is absolutely central moving forward. I know that the Democratic Socialists of America have an organizing project right now. They're basically anybody who is working on a job right now and wants help figuring out how to address unsafe conditions at work. There are DSA members who are happy to assist in strategizing about how to do that. Without that, we're going to continue seeing a response such that both parties seem to have wanted to put forward so far in response to the pandemic, which is one that is a massive giveaway. I mean, like the 2008 bailout on steroids to corporations that are only going to, maintain and worsen the massive inequality that we have in this society. And so that kind of action is absolutely crucial going forward. Of course, it's no accident. I don't know if you saw Bernie tweeted the other day that any worker that is going on strike in response to the coronavirus pandemic, that he supports them. So you need that kind of interplay between average people who are willing to take those kinds of risky but powerful actions on the job and politicians who have these left-wing commitments who are willing to back them up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I guess my feeling going forward is that presumably the waters of this flood of pandemic will recede. And I'd love to see that energy continue. But I do want to talk, and again, we're talking with Micah Uetricht about the new book he co-authored, Bigger Than Bernie. I do want to talk about the Democratic Party, because I thought that you and Megan Day weighed this very carefully and addressed this very carefully. And the sense I got was that, for example, you write that the Democratic Party is fundamentally a capitalist party, which its leaders certainly acknowledge, and that the argument for not working with it at all is that the party is a graveyard for other kinds of self-organized working class movements we need. But you guys have what strikes me as a more nuanced kind of strategic interim approach to the Democratic Party. Am I reading you correctly there?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the basic problem is that the Democratic Party is a fundamentally capitalist party, as opposed to other countries like, Canada has the New Democratic Party, which is its social democratic party with close ties to the labor movement, or the Labour Party in the UK. Those parties have often moved rightwards in recent years, but they don't have the same kind of capitalist interests that are at the heart of the party in the way that the Democratic Party does. Now, this is a very old problem in the United States,
right?
One that leftist socialists have wrestled with for a very long time. And the two solutions have been basically, one, say, okay, this party is terrible. We're just going to break with them. We're going to go start our own third party over here. We're going to start the working class party that we need. And of course, the fact that we do not have a credible working class party in this country shows that strategy has pretty much failed. I mean, I voted for the Green Party in many elections, but we all know that they're not on the precipice of breaking through, into winning the White House or anything else. So the other strategy has been, okay, well, we're stuck with this party, so let's just, let's make lemonade with the lemons we've been dealt. And I sympathize with that, because it's trying to be a kind of realist approach. That it's too bad that all of these structural forces are against starting a real working class party, but this is the hand we've been dealt, so let's work within it. But of course, there are many examples over the years of people who have had strong left-wing politics but have gone into the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party has pulled them to the right, precisely because it is such a capitalist party. It has these real conservatizing effects on people who get involved in the party. And so you need a solution that kind of can not allow you to be pulled all the way to the right within the party, but also so you're not totally isolated and defanged in American politics. And this is what we call the dirty break strategy. As opposed to the first strategy I mentioned, the clean break. You just make a clean break from the Democrats, and then you don't end up getting anywhere. The dirty break strategy says the Democratic Party is unfortunately the only game in town in most places in the U.S. So we're going to work within that party when it makes sense. But we're also going to understand that this party is fundamentally set up to work against working class people's interests. And so we're going to use its ballot line, but we're going to say that this party is not our friend, and we're going to maintain some level of independence from that party. Now, at Jacobin, the magazine that I work for, we've published a lot about what the strategy can look like. Seth Ackerman, one of our editors, has said that you use the Democratic Party ballot line, but you have an organization that you're ultimately accountable to that can keep you disciplined to a good, solid left-wing agenda, something that acts like a party without being the name on the ballot line. And for me, the best hope that we have for that is the Democratic Socialists of America. And so we have many people who are members of the Democratic Socialists of America, but then also run for office as Democrats, but they're, constantly butting heads with the kind of Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer wing of the party. And the hope is that someday we'll be able to use that, to build momentum, to build energy, to build our numbers, to eventually form our own working class party. But we're not putting a date stamp on when that's going to happen, precisely because there's so much that is organized against us right now on a structural level from being able to do that. So it's a strategy to deal with the hand that we have been dealt with this Democratic Party, the only game in town, but not allowing ourselves to be, to have our ideals totally smashed by a party whose fundamental allegiances are to the 1% and not to working class people.
And there are those who say that the Democratic Party establishment has an allegiance to the 10% as well as the 1%, to the professional class. But it's interesting. I didn't know that about Seth Ackerman's thinking. I've felt for a long time there has to be a way to use the Democratic Party as a vehicle, but to be in it the way that Thoreau used to say he was in the world but not of it. And
right.
And I guess as the only other thought I have on that, Micah Uetricht, is maybe is it possible, particularly given the demographic trends of how younger people view the economy and so on. I've studied Democratic polling a lot, of just taking it over.
Well, that was obviously the hope in the Bernie Sanders campaign, right?
Right.
That if Bernie had won, then he would be the head of the Democratic Party. And if that had happened, we now know that that is not going to happen, obviously. But if it had happened, you can imagine, I don't know, the Third Way, the think tank organization.
I know them well.
You're very well aware of them.
Yeah. We're long-term adversaries. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Dead set against the kind of politics that Bernie represented. And you could imagine those kind of folks saying, I can't be in the same party as this, I can't be in the party that Bernie Sanders is the head of. That is the strategy that has been pursued by many people on the left over the years. It's often called a realignment strategy. It has made some important successes. We know that, for example, the Southern white supremacists were driven out of the Democratic Party after the civil rights movement. And that's a major accomplishment that nobody should downplay, one of the most incredible accomplishments in American politics. But since then, we don't have these open white supremacists in the party anymore, but we do have people who are very friendly to Wall Street and to real estate and to all these other sectors of capital. So the party has kept moving rightwards, and we haven't been able to fundamentally realign the party's politics. And so I think that we should continue doing what Bernie has done. And by the way, Bernie was able to do that because he has this almost world historically stubborn individual personality where he refuses to give in to the enticements of being in the halls of power, right? And I think that's a reflection of something that's very unique about Bernie. I'm not sure that we can count on every single person who runs as a kind of left progressive reformer or even a socialist to be able to have that same kind of self-discipline that Bernie has. And that's why we need organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America or like the Sunrise Movement or other people who are also accountable to, who can make sure that when the right-wing Democrats put out the goodies to our newly elected left-wing elected officials, we're able to make sure that they know not to grab the goodies and to be actually accountable to people who want to see the world change in a progressive direction.
Yeah, those is a great point. Those seductions of power are incredibly powerful. Here in Washington, D.C., and I can say, unfortunately, Troy's going to have to blip this out, but having worked for Bernie, he genuinely doesn't give a shit. He just doesn't. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I encourage people to read the book. It's important, I think. My guest has been Micah Uetricht. Micah, I didn't see your managing editor of Jacobin. I should have read your bio a little more carefully. He's managing editor of Jacobin and co-author of the newly released book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. Thanks for the great work in writing the book, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.